very warm welcome to Bharata First. You're watching the Discourse with me, Rausan Pereira. Since you're here, please like the video, subscribe, hit the bell icon, and share the content so that more people get to know about Bharata First. Right. Prime Minister Narendra Modi proposed a multi-modal connectivity and economic corridor linking Southeast Asia, India, West Asia, and Europe during the Asean-India Summit in Indonesia last week. This was part of a 12-point plan to enhance relations with ASEAN economies. The proposal also suggests that India is keen to play a more active role in the region, and its growing economic and political influence and its desire to position itself at the center of the global supply chain hub. In this edition of the Discourse, we will analyze the 20th ASEAN-India Summit. Joining me on the program today is Professor Srikanth Kondapalli, Dean, School of International Studies, JNU. Professor, thank you so much for joining me on the program. Let's analyze the 20th ASEAN-India Summit, what it means, what were the key highlights, and what stood out for you.
I think, as you mentioned, Frank, the September 7th meeting, one major takeaway is this economic corridor. And as you know, that the G20 also had the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, linking up with what Prime Minister had cobbled up in Jakarta. I think this is a major effort for trade integration, for commerce, for investments, for digital connectivity as well. Ports, railways, and so on and so forth have all been mentioned. India has been at the forefront in constructing the Sabang port in Indonesia. And the current plan for economic corridor, in addition to the multimodal project with the Kaladan project in Myanmar, this is going to increase the maritime trade component and integration. I think this is good news because as India is growing at 7 to 8%, this is very essential for the trade aspects to be furthered. So this is one major takeaway from the 20th India-ASEAN Summit meeting. There is also the agreement between the Indian and the ASEAN leaders for enhancing economic cooperation between the two, especially in areas of infrastructure development. And there is also the maritime cooperation. They had been working together on counter-piracy missions. This is important because half of the global piracy incidents are now happening in Southeast Asia, especially off the waters of Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The organization MALSINDO, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, is not able to cope up with the kind of piracy incidents that are happening. If you remember, the Indian Ocean used to be the largest before, but with the International Task Force and Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS, they were able to tackle the piracy incidents. But today, Southeast Asia has much of this. Also, terrorism. The Abu Sayyaf group in Philippines and in other countries are making their heads. So this is one area where India, which has a huge counter-terrorism campaign and exercises, is trying to share the experience with the ASEAN countries. There is also the climate change, the marine environment issues that have been discussed in this meeting, in addition to the comprehensive strategic partnership agreement that was signed some years ago on how to bring in more effectiveness for this is what the current effort is. I think this is significant because the trade component is increasing due to the integration process. Currently, the bilateral trade is about $130 billion. India has a huge trade deficit with the ASEAN countries, almost roughly about $40 to $50 billion of trade surplus that the ASEAN countries have. and this is a major concern. Although ASEAN is the third largest trading partner for India after the United States and China.
Right.
So this is a major figure. The second driver is the investments. India made almost $56 billion of investment in Southeast Asia. In return, India is also getting a lot of investments from Singapore, for example, and other countries. So there is a lot of to and fro investments in this. Of course, India did not sign the RCEP, raising concerns on China. But I think this is an aspect which is worth exploring further on the next steps in the free trade agreement with the ASEAN countries. There is a lot of demand for Indian products in Southeast Asia. There is also a favorable climate that is now after the COVID-19 and after India had supplied millions of doses of vaccines for countering the pandemic. And I think there is also the different countries in ASEAN like Vietnam, Indonesia. They have been making several efforts to attract investments. So I think a lot of things are moving in a positive direction here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor, for summing that up for us. Let me now welcome on board Gurjit Singh, former ambassador of India to Germany, Indonesia, and ASEAN, among other countries. Ambassador, welcome. Pleasure as always to have you here.
Right. Good to be here. Thank you.
And looking dapper as always too.
Thank you.
So we were discussing about the key takeaways and highlights of the 20th ASEAN-India Summit. Of course, the big ticket one being connectivity to ASEAN, and beyond, as well as many of those other issues as well. Ambassador, how would you look back at the summit? Because this has been a hectic past week for us as far as foreign policy is concerned.
Thank you. So I was in Jakarta actually at the time of the summit, because I was invited to the Indo-Pacific Forum. So just to explain to your viewers, at the time of the ASEAN Summit, three kinds of things happen. One is the ASEAN Summit itself. Then there is the ASEAN +1 summits with its dialogue partners like India. And finally, there is the East Asia Summit, which has 18 major countries in it. So this time, Prime Minister Modi came for the ASEAN-India Summit and the East Asia Summit, both of which were on the 7th of September. Many countries had their ASEAN +1 summits earlier, but due to the timing of Prime Minister Modi's convenience, they kept it all on one day, due to which Prime Minister Modi had actually no bilaterals because there was no time. But his participation at the ASEAN-India Summit and the East Asia Summit was essentially to reiterate that India is committed to ASEAN centrality, would like to have ASEAN united and stay relevant. Now, why do we say this? Because India and ASEAN in last year, 2022, at the 30th anniversary, became comprehensive, secure, strategic partners. We became strategic partners in 2012 when we finished 20 years. So India, China, the US, and now Japan and Korea will become strategic partners. What Prime Minister Modi in his speech said, and he laid out a 12-point program. This 12-point program, all of which was not new, but they were points, is the action plan for the comprehensive strategic partnership. And this CSP and consequently the ASEAN partnership is an integral part of India's Act East policy, which is now getting to be 10 years old. This was the context. Now, the summit is not long enough. It's about 1 hour to have deep discussion. It's like a statement. So I think the Indian statement was very well crafted. And it has important things like trade, maritime security, a digital economy, and things like that. Now, why are they important? So in 2019, ASEAN announced its outlook for the Indo-Pacific. And in 2021, India and ASEAN signed a AOIP and IPOI cooperation agreement, Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative of India, which India announced at the East Asia Summit. That is why from the beginning, I'm linking the ASEAN, India and to the EA, because like a continuum. So the AOIP, the IPOI and the AOIP, IPOI coordination. ASEAN believes that there are 4 elements of the AOIP in which we must collaborate, and that is maritime security, the economy, the sustainable development goals, things like that. I mean, it's all very anodyne, and India's 12 points and what we have got in the IPOI is all into that. What is interesting is that the IPOI has attracted Indonesia and Singapore as supporters of specific pillars, while Philippines and Vietnam are looking. So this is where India draws sustenance. But after all this is happening in a context. So if you want, I'll explain that context about China, Myanmar, and the Indo-Pacific now, or I could do it in response to a later question.
We'll come back to that as well, Ambassador. But since you brought up China, I'd like to take that aspect up with the professor. You know, Professor, this particular multi-modal connectivity and economic corridor, some analysts are calling it, an answer to China's BRI. Is that what it is? And secondly, how is China looking at all of this?
Well, I think the multimodal and transport corridors and economic corridors, I think this is baby steps right now in this direction for integration between India and Southeast Asia. We have had the multimodal transport corridor with the Myanmar, Thailand extended highway, but this has not completely done so far. On the other hand, the BRI has several projects already completed. For example, the Laos high-speed railway, the high-speed railway connecting to Bandung in Indonesia, and the Malaysian railway line as well. These are up and running, and many other projects in energy that the BRI had launched in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in other areas have already been completed. Of course, there is a controversy about these in terms of the interest rates, debt accumulation. For example, the Hanoi Metro is coming at 0.4% interest rate, the second phase of that. Likewise, we do not know how much exactly is Laos going to spend as part of the debts that they have accumulated. And Mahathir Mohamad once told the Chinese to kind of cut down the costs with the railway line, and he made some amendments in regard to that. Likewise, the Indonesians have tweaked the high-speed railway. So there are the plan Bs that have come about in the BRI projects. Very many of those projects have been tweaked so far because of the local resistance or demand for reduction in the costs of these projects. Overall, there is this competition between the corridor, economic corridor, and the BRI projects. But China has a huge lead already. The reason being, China's trade with ASEAN is nearly $900 billion, while India's trade with ASEAN is about $135 billion. Likewise, investments. India's total investments are about $56 billion in the ASEAN countries till last year, while China had, under these BRI projects, invested or granted or made other financial contributions, commitments for these BRI projects. So there is a huge difference in China-India responses. But what is important is that the ASEAN increasingly is looking for India in the recent times, given the backlash against China, not just on the sovereignty dispute, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in July 2016 and the aftermath, and the reluctance of many ASEAN countries, affected ASEAN countries, to sign the Code of Conduct because it is seen as very coercive from the Chinese side. And so the Code of Conduct has not been signed, given the Declaration of Conduct's experience with the Southeast Asian countries, because the declaration in November 2002 didn't have any provisions regarding what should be done for the offender of those provisions in the declaration. So there is a lot of reluctance. And the other factor is the United States is also now very active. Japan has been active. Australia has also now been stepping in for aid and also military-related, sales like fast attack craft and others. India has also opened up in the recent times. The BrahMos has been sold to the Philippines, and there is the idea that Vietnam may also be interested in this. In addition to the bilateral and multilateral naval exercises and the space program that we coupled up with Vietnam some years ago. Mm-hmm. So I think there are alternative, help that is provided to the ASEAN countries, and hence I think ASEAN is also now becoming more circumspect in relation to China. So right. This is a whole package, economic and security and other aspects.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ambassador, coming back to you now, go ahead. You are making a point about the context and the background really as far as the summits are concerned.
I think we were talking about China. So while I was there, they were sniggering because when the Asian Games were held in Jakarta, the Japanese funded Jakarta Metro started, overspent by 1.2 billion. So there is not enough happening with China, though there has been a lot in the past. Second, the cartographic aggression on ASEAN continues. So the publication of Chinese maps just before the ASEAN summit riled a lot of people, and several countries made bilateral protests. Indonesia as a host kept rather quiet and made a quiet protest rather than bring it up in the ASEAN-China meeting. The Chinese Prime Minister ticked off ASEAN for trying to get closer to other countries, saying don't bring a Cold War mentality to this region. The reality is that where defense and security is concerned, ASEAN is buying more from middle powers like Korea, Turkey, Israel, India, and not from China, and even ignoring Russia and the US for now. But the second point was that China is not the lead investor in infrastructure in ASEAN. This is a misnomer. Even till today, Japan is. India is not a competitor to China. But if you look at the Southeast Asia survey of 2023, China's trust is diminishing in ASEAN, and India's trust from about 3 to 4% has risen to 20%. So this is the reality. You don't have to simply keep investing to earn trust. That is one lesson that you draw from ASEAN at the moment. And I think the final point is the ASEAN is now not reluctant to embrace the Indo-Pacific concept. They held the Indo-Pacific Forum. President Jokowi and 8 other ASEAN leaders stood on stage and welcomed the Indo-Pacific. You may recall that China always did not like the Indo-Pacific. But here they were all and saying Indo-Pacific is our region. We will contribute to prosperity. They were not using the term Asia-Pacific except in some documents.
Absolutely. Very rightly said there. All right. It's time to get closing comments now from both the panelists with the best way forward and what next and what to look out for. Starting first with you, Professor.
I think there should be a mechanism to monitor the progress on the multimodal project and economic corridor. The experience with Myanmar and Thailand have been, um, these projects have been very slow. Of course, there is a ground reality which can be an explanation. The Rohingya crisis and 2021 military coup as possible, delays. But nevertheless, I think given the other Southeast Asian countries' urge to enhance their economic growth rates, I think a monitoring mechanism is needed to look at the progress of these corridors. This is very crucial for the India, Southeast Asia, West Asia, Europe, on which the Prime Minister has promised that there will be, after 2 months, some kind of a review process on all the G20 declarations, but also more specifically on the economic corridor. Now that this is linked to Southeast Asia, so there should be a project verification mechanism that is needed, number one. Number two, the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. There are a number of tariff barriers and other restrictions on the trade-related matters. I think a harmonization of all these is necessary to send a signal to the ASEAN countries and to India about the effectiveness of the CEPA agreement.
Right. And Ambassador, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
So I think on the review of the ITGA, ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, it has finally been agreed just before the summit. But our timeline was next year and the ASEAN timeline is 2025. So there is a mismatch of expectations over there. But I think the main buzz was the digital economy. I was invited to speak at the Indo-Pacific Forum on 2 sessions and both pertain to digital economy. So everybody was buzzing about India's digital economic progress. Now, ASEAN itself is coming up with a digital economic framework agreement. Now, they are very keen that we associate with that. Other countries like Australia, Japan have already said so, but they all said that is fine. We want India to come because India has the lead. So I think after G20 is now over, we are going to associate with them. And this is where I think the big thing will happen. Singapore and India already have UPI interface. Now there's going to be an ASEAN payment system led by Singapore. Once that is done, the UPI interface will be with the whole of ASEAN. I look forward to that.
Yes, we all look forward to that and hope that happens sooner rather than later. And there is no real, change in ideas, so to speak, or change in timelines as well. With that, we'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of The Discourse. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Much pleasure as always, Professor and Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.